Okay, good morning. Time now 8 a.m. actually sharp in Tokyo, Japan Standard Time on July 20th, 2023. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koicho Mori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminars to introduce the latest report by the World Bank presented by the authors of those reports. This morning, we are featuring the latest report titled Exports to Improve Labor Market in the Middle East and North Africa. We are extraordinarily pleased to have two authors of those reports connecting from the United States. Let me introduce the two speakers very briefly. First, we have Gladys Lopez Acevedo, who is the lead economist and global lead in the poverty and equity global practice of the World Bank. Gladys, good evening, good morning to you. Thanks for joining. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, hear you very well. Thank you, Koichi.
Thank you very much. Super. And then also, we have pleased to have another speaker, Professor Raymond Robertson from the Texas A&M University, joining us. I think from the Texas, I heard from Raymond that he may be expecting to some sort of technical disturbance because of the storm coming into your region, but hopefully we'll be able to keep you connected. Raymond, good morning, good evening to you. Welcome. Great, thank you very much. So as usual, we are going to listen to both Gladys and Raymond presenting the main point of the report, exports to the improved labor market in the Middle East and North Africa. So next probably 35-40 minutes. And then after their presentations, I'll read the question that we received from the viewers. If you did not send your question in advance, please do so by sending your questions through the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section on the YouTube screen. I'll read your question on your behalf, asking them to respond after their keynote presentations. So with that, I would like to formally invite both Gladys and Raymond to come in to start the presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Koichi. It's really a pleasure to be with you once again. Thank you very much for hosting this seminar and this presentation. As you mentioned, this is a collaborative effort with other colleagues, the World Bank in universities. So it was an important effort that took more than 2 years to materialize. The title, Exports to Improve Labor Markets in MENA, the publication is available online. And we're happy to say now that we have translations into French, Arabic, and English. So we invite you to please browse it and also provide us with feedback. So the motivation for this report is straightforward and is very important because rising trade has been associated with falling poverty and inequality in many developing countries. There is by now a consensus that trade and growth are positively related. However, the effects of trade agreements on labor markets are heterogeneous. The specific interactions that we have in terms of trade policy, trade flows, and labor markets are not well understood, and this requires in-depth country analysis. So this was our main motivation in order to undertake this particular report for the Middle East and North Africa region, which is to better understand the relation between trade flows and labor markets. And we focus on three very distinct countries in the region: Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, which are very diverse, have gone through different stages in terms of development, in terms of trade and labor markets, as we are going to explain. So the way we have structured the presentation is the first part is talking about the trends in terms of trade and labor markets in the region, the approach that we use in the report, just to discuss some of the results in terms of trade, and then go deeper into the country cases for Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. Finalize with remarks and policy recommendations. So in terms of the context for trade and labor markets in Middle East and North Africa region, it's very important because following trade liberalization in MENA that occurred during the 2000s, as it happened in many other countries, the region experienced an economic boom. In this period, total trade rose significantly. And as we can see, there was an important reduction in tariffs, particularly in these countries. However, these changes in trade policy, trends in terms of trade, did not really translate into, we would say, like improvements in terms of labor market outcomes measured in terms of employment, wages, informality, and female labor force participation. It has been well documented in the case of the region that MENA has one of the lowest female labor force participations and high informality. We have another report where we go into more detail in terms of the labor market. But yeah, the results in terms of labor markets has been quite disappointed. So with this in our mind is we wanted to understand how can trade be leveraged in order to improve better labor market outcomes in the region. The region has been kind of relatively close inward looking. They are looking for sources of growth and how to trade more. So it's very important to understand how trade can make a difference in the lives of people. So these graphs only shows some of the things I mentioned to you, that the female, what are the indicators in terms of female and labor force participation in selected countries in the region and how they compare with other countries, and also in terms of unemployment rates by gender and region. And as you can see, it's, really it's stark in the comparison in terms of the gap. So we thought a lot in terms of how to analyze this relationship between trade flows and labor markets in the region. And to answer this question, our approach focuses in terms of these steps. First, try to understand trade policy, the trade agreements, institutional reforms in a lot of detail in these countries. Then also to understand the trade flows in terms of trends of exports and imports. For this first part, as we will discuss, it is use a gravity model in order to understand how the trade agreements have, what has been the impact in terms of exports and imports and how it compares to other regions. Then we connect this analysis with local labor markets, focusing on indicators such as employment, wages, informality, female labor participation. Here we will discuss it's an approach in terms of the Bartik, looking at local labor markets. How is that exports or imports affect local labor markets in these countries? And one additional step that we undertook in this report, which is really of a lot of value added, is to go beyond workers and also to understand the connection with firm, and to try to understand whether it can help us to understand the industrial organization, to explain this connection between trade and local labor markets. So I think, the framework, the approach, the data, and the analysis are something that have not been done in the region and is of a great value. So in terms of this first part that I mentioned to you, in terms of trying to understand how the trade agreements affect imports and exports, the team applied a gravity model to determine the relation between trade agreements and labor market outcomes. So a lot has been written in terms of this approach and how it's used. So I am not going to be discussing the literature around this. But so certainly the objective in this approach is to try to understand how trade agreements can affect imports and exports, and what are the factors that help us to understand this. And then compare these changes, within countries, but also across countries that could be most similar to a reference like Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt. And also, I'm not going to stop too much in terms of the methodology for the Bartik, the localized labor markets, but this approach we use it in order to understand at a very granular, detailed level how is that labor markets behave, and whether this can help us to understand the connection with exports and imports. This empirical analysis focus on these three countries, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, which are very diverse. It is important because they underwent a lot of changes in terms of trade agreements, and also an important increase in terms of manufacturing, which is why we selected them. So in terms of trade agreements, what are the results? So interestingly, in the case of Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, they signed 19 regional trade agreements during the period of analysis for the report. As we had discussed in this period, also there was an increase in trade. And also based on the analysis of these regional trade agreements, the result shows that it did a good job at boosting trade flows. So in principle, this is good news. I mean, these trade agreements work on what they were intended to do, which was boosting trade flows. And then now we are going to discuss the results country by country. And it's very important to say that, for instance, Morocco, in the case of Morocco, the trade openness reduced labor informality. This is documented in the approach, in the report, but failed to increase employment of opportunities for women. Interestingly, what we found is that the trade patterns shifted from female labor-intensive to male capital-intensive industries, which did promote labor formalization, but it was in favor of men over women. So this positive impact of exports on employment occurred mainly in male-dominated sectors. And this is very interesting because contrary to other countries where trade promotes manufacturing, and it has an important effect on female labor participation, Here, in the case of Morocco, internal and external factors left light manufacturing behind, and it was more skewed towards capital-intensive industries. And of course, as we will see, this had consequences on the labor market. So this slide only provides a little bit more detail about what we are talking about in terms of the trade patterns that happen in the case of Morocco, on which it shifted from to more capital-intensive industries. And it's also very interesting because Morocco experienced an important growth during the last 2-3 decades. And remember, when I was there, the country was saying, well, okay, why is that despite increasing growth, we have not generated job creation? And, we have these problems with the labor market. So when we were looking in more detail in terms of, this composition of growth and also the composition of trade, it's clear or evident this pattern that Morocco was an exporter of textiles and apparel, more recently to machinery and electronics. But basically what happened is that when the end of the multi-fiber arrangement, 2004, the surge of China textiles to export to the EU, and Morocco was not able to keep up with the competition from other countries after the end of the MFA, despite the government implementing several industrial policies. So there was this decline of manufacturing, and so other capital-intensive industries took off. Chemicals, or now even like automotive, but it's very capital intensive. And so there was nothing in the middle between the light manufacturing and the capital intensive goods. And people were displaced, particularly this affected women. So on one hand, this positive trade shock that we were saying, like during this period, these countries undertook important measures towards trade liberalization, contribute to less informality for both men and women, but to begin with, informality rates in top exported sectors are low overall level of informality for Morocco. But the female share of employment was higher in job losing industries. So this also helped us to explain why is that there was this decrease on female level of participation. Well, this slide only shows the composition of labor market across regions in Morocco, and these are the regions that are analyzed in the report in more detail. And it's interesting because, like with any of the changes in terms of trade or trade liberalization, there were some areas which gained and some others which lost. The same like with particular groups between women and men. And this is also documented in this report. Also, we did a job diagnostic for Morocco, which also documents this increase in regional disparities. So I'm mindful of the time and that Raymond has to cover 2 more countries plus the policy recommendations. Just to reiterate the analysis in terms of these localized effects of trade that shows that higher exports indeed decrease informality, but that also there was this shift in the composition, as I mentioned, from male to female and to more capital-intensive industries that help us to explain us this trend in terms of female labor participation. So we wanted to go beyond what happened to workers and also understand the role of firms and whether the role of firms could help us to explain this unexpected outcome of expos reducing female labor participation. And what is interesting is that, which is consistent with the finding, is the number of exporting firms is lower among female labor-intensive firms compared to male labor-intensive. And of course, exporters tend to be older since they are established, so it's more biased towards male or capital-intensive industries. So this, just to reiterate the connection. In the case of Morocco, we see trade liberalization, we see an increase in the flows of trade, we see an increase in exports, but remember that Morocco couldn't keep up with at the end of the MFA, light manufacturing disappeared, and then they went into more capital-intensive or male-dominated industries, which help in the case of informality, but reduce female level of participation, and is consistent with industrial organization because firms where women tend to work are smaller, don't really export, so it's like a vicious circle that just reiterate the difficulty for women to be able to take advantage of exporting opportunities. Thank you. Now we go to Raymond in case of Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gladys. And thank you to the organizers as well. I appreciate the nice introduction, Kochi. I appreciate it. So we're going to move on to Tunisia. Similar to Morocco, right? Tunisia's positive foreign demand shocks concentrate again in male-intensive industries. Most of you might be aware that Tunisia is a labor-abundant country. We would normally think of Tunisia as a developing labor-abundant country, but a lot of the foreign demand shocks were focused more on male and capital-intensive industries. There was also domestic changes that affected the domestic labor markets, of course. But as Gladys was mentioning with Morocco, right, labor markets are characterized by gender imbalances, female employment and female unemployment and lower female labor force participation. So our results, when we applied the same methodology, which was to first look at the effect of the trade agreements, and then we looked at how those changes in trade flows affected local labor market outcomes, we found very similar results in Morocco, that increases in exports, which were driven obviously by the exogenous demand changes in the rest of the world, were associated with reductions in female employment relative to male employment. So there was a definite shift away from the demand for females and an increase in the relative demand for males. Can we go to the next slide, please, Gladys? So just to look at some of the overview of trade flows and labor markets in the aftermath, right, of the Arab Spring, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but gender gaps in employment have increased and exports had generally gone down. So you see that unemployment rates, particularly for females, are very high. You can see here hovering around 25%, which is very high, especially when compared to global levels. And then if you look at income and export growth, you also see a falling GDP or GNI per capita. So there's a lot of concern, as Gladys mentioned, about this relationship between trade. Why isn't trade really helping labor markets, and how is it feeding back into the gendered employment? Next slide, please. So one of the big concerns that came out of the report on Tunisia, the Tunisia chapter, was this importance of the segmentation of industries and occupations by gender. And this I cannot emphasize enough. I mean, this is not just a Tunisia phenomenon. This is happening around the world, where for some reason we have female intensive industries and male intensive industries. And you can see here that if you compare mining or transportation, hotels and restaurants, at the bottom of the graph, right, that very, very few women are working in those industries as a female share of total employment. And you look at textiles, and this is mainly what we mean there as apparel, so manufacturing clothing is heavily populated by women. So for whatever reason, right, I mean, there is this concentration of women in some industries and not others, and we're calling that gender segmentation. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide that the relationship between export growth and initial female intensity is negative, right? So that the export growth tended to concentrate in those industries that have very little female employment. And so because of this segmentation across genders, the increase in exports, which did not favor women, reduced the demand for women, and that really reduced the female labor market outcomes that we're very concerned about for obviously lots of reasons. Next slide, please. So the identification strategy for analysis, as Gladys mentioned, right, comes from the different industries are exposed to exports differently, right? And you can also see that there's a variation in this exposure across space. And you look at the changing over time, where a lot of the decomposition of the Tunisian labor force is relatively constant. Except there's a shift out of agriculture and more into services. So this premature industrialization seems to be emerging a little bit there. And then if you look at exports, right, services are declining and obviously manufacturing is increasing. And so that's why we wanted to understand the variation within manufacturing, right? Because the manufacturing obviously was increasing. What type of industries were expanding given the increase in exports? So next slide, please. There we go. So there we go. Let's hold on to that one. So again, the identification strategy that Gladys described, which we're calling the Bartik, or it's otherwise known as the shift share approach, compares exposure to exports across regions within the country based on the a priori or the previous employment shares of the different industries. So what we found when we compared the changes in exports across different regions within Tunisia was that regions with higher growth exposure to exports had lower female employment growth. So there was a clear negative association between the female employment and the export growth. And again, this is just reinforcing this idea that females were losing out as a result of changes in exports. And the exports were clearly very male biased. We can go to the next slide, please. So the results actually, so what we did was then we said, well, what happens to these women after the demand for women falls in the labor market? Well, there's two usual options for those of you who are economists. And that is, you know, women might move into other industries. They might move into those industries that expand. And that's sort of the neoclassical story. You'd expect that some industries expand and some contract, and workers in the longer run would just shift to the expanding industries. But because of this prevalent gender segmentation of the labor market, women don't have the option, for whatever reason, to move into these other industries. Maybe they don't want to, or maybe it's cultural or whatever. So instead, what we found was that women actually just drop out of the labor force rather than move into either unemployment or into those other male-dominated sectors. And we see these effects emerge especially strongly for married women rather than single women. So if you know the literature on sort of household labor market decisions, married women are often considered the secondary wage earner. And so when demand for women falls, a lot of times, apparently in Tunisia, these women will just drop out of the labor force. And this has very significant implications for growth and economic development. And what we see is the expansion of males, right, allowed for the industries to expand that were male intensive, and men took advantage of that. And so men expanded their hours and their employment while women cut back and stayed home. Next slide, please. So those are the main lessons from Tunisia. As Gladys mentioned at the very beginning, the reason why we're doing these 3 different country studies is because these effects of trade and labor markets are very heterogeneous across countries. Around the world, the effects vary a lot. So now we shifted over to the Arab Republic of Egypt. And we see here that trade liberalization was very effective. So Gladys already showed you the results for trade agreements and how Egypt's trade agreements were actually very effective at increasing trade. So Egypt was doing a great job at signing very productive trade agreements that really increased exports in particular, right? There was not as much of an increase in imports, so there was not as much competition, but exports really increased. But what we found when we tried to identify the at least correlation between those increasing exports and local labor market outcomes was that these higher exports, which Egypt was experiencing, actually correlated with lower wages, especially for low-skilled workers, and no meaningful improvements for informality or female labor force participation. So this really presented a significant puzzle, right? Like around the world, Gladys mentioned that there's a strong positive relationship between trade and growth and development and income. But in Egypt, we're finding almost no relationship at all. So then we moved into the firm level analysis and we tried to understand, right, if exports are increasing, are firms not expanding employment? Are they just substituting away from domestic production? Are they, what's going on at the firm level? And at the firm level, we found that although employment rose in response to trade shocks, so we did find that firms increase employment when demand increases, which was a very positive and welcome sign, the increase was not large enough to be felt in the economy-wide level. And another way to phrase that is that the trade agreements worked and exports increased, but exports are such a small share of the overall economy that even the expansion within the exporting firms didn't really do enough to put a dent in those labor market outcomes that we are most concerned about. So that actually is really significant. It has significant policy implications as well. Next slide, please. So just to expand a little bit on the trade liberalization, right? We mentioned that Egypt implemented a series of trade liberalization measures, and especially these trade agreements, which were especially effective. They did reduce tariffs on all products. You could see that big drop, especially in the early 2000s. And not surprisingly, the exports of goods and services then rose dramatically right at the same time. So when we did the formal gravity analysis to estimate the relationship between those trade agreements and Egypt's exports in particular, we found a strong positive relationship. Next slide, please. But again, there's a lot of frustration about the underperforming labor markets. The key labor market indicators, such as female labor force participation, informality, real wages, were not really increasing as trade occurred. And this is really what was motivating a lot of our interest in Egypt to try and unravel that dilemma. Please go ahead. So when we look at the Bartik results, this is I already summarized them, but this is giving you more detail. The impact on wages, we see that in the short run, right, districts that are more exposed to increased exports actually had falling real wages, but that dissipates. So basically our main conclusion is that there's no statistically significant effect at all. And it's possible that imports are weakening the link between exports and labor market variables, but we find that imports are actually associated with a negative effect on wages, but it's even smaller than the effect on exports. So it's not the fact that just imports are flooding in and driving down wages. Obviously, there's other factors at play. So especially when you look at manufacturing, that's when we found the biggest decrease in wages. But again, it's not something that lasts. It's not statistically significant in the long run. Next slide. So we look at informality in the short and the long run. Higher exports don't seem to have any effect at all on informality, which is different than obviously Morocco and Tunisia. We look at, between 2009 and 2012, the correlation between exports and informality is negative, and there's less informality. In the long run, the correlation is negative. On the import side, which we also analyzed imports as well as exports, there's a positive but super small effect And it might be right that the young workers are the only group really to have some of the setback. I mean, but basically, when you look at that table, the effects are just really tiny, and they're just not statistically significant at all. Gladys, if we can move on. Yeah, so if we look at female labor force participation as well, higher exports appeared to have no significant effect on either the short run or the long run. The effects of imports are stronger than exports, but again, in the long run, there's nothing statistically significant here. So the higher imports after liberalization don't seem to have helped local labor markets, which they might if they were complementary with local labor demand. But overall, right, the effects of trade, even though trade is increasing, it's not having a significant effect on labor markets basically anywhere. Next slide, please. So again, we wanted to dive into this mystery, this kind of puzzle, which seems kind of surprising, right? I mean, how do we explain that broken link? So basically what we found was that the exporting firms are just simply too small of a segment of the local labor market to have an effect on aggregate employment. We don't find evidence that firms are holding on to idle workers, right? That's another hypothesis, is that firms make up for the increase in export demand by just putting those idle workers to work that they already had hired, but that doesn't seem to be the case. We also find, as you know, Bernard, Schott, and Redding, and others have found in the United States, that exporting firms are capital intensive. Therefore, they are able to expand production using new machinery or extending the run of existing machinery. But even so, right, while some firm level production shifts, overall, the number of firms undergoing that shift are relatively few. So we do see that firms increase their use of inputs, capital and labor, to meet the demand for exports, but there's just not enough exporting going on to affect the national or even local labor markets. Next slide, please. Okay. So just to be mindful of the time, we're finishing exactly on time. I think we're supposed to finish in 40 minutes or so. So just to wrap up, we have some concluding remarks and policy recommendations. The first one, obviously, is that doing these country by country case studies is really important because the heterogeneity across countries is significant, right? Every country is experiencing trade and labor markets in a different way. So we found that there's a lot of value in undergoing country by country. In particular, when we look at trade agreements in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, all of these agreements did increase trade. And the main point I'd like to leave you with is many of you might be saying, well, yeah, that's what trade agreements are supposed to do. But there's a number of recent papers which actually document a lot of heterogeneity in trade agreements. And it's not a given that trade agreements actually increase trade. And there's lots of examples, and some studies, you know, have a pretty high percentage of trade agreements that have no or even a negative effect on trade. So this really is a significant result that Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt are increasing trade as a result of these trade agreements. We've also documented that economic growth increased after those trade flows increased as we expected. But when we drill down to those individual labor market outcomes, we find that trade does not necessarily translate into improved labor market outcomes, particularly for everyone, right? I mean, it's not that the benefits are widespread. If you look at Morocco and Tunisia, the shifting trade and increasing exports really favored men over women, and they're not creating jobs for women. And I don't think I need to explain to this audience that women's participation in the economy is absolutely critical for economic development for a large number of reasons, whether it's population or the contribution or ideas or talent or whatever. There's lots of reasons why it's important. And so we're seen to be missing an important opportunity when women are not being incorporated into the economy in these countries. So that's one of the big concerns, right, is that these foreign demand shocks are concentrated in male-intensive industries, and they were limiting employment opportunities for women. And that actually, to some degree or other, happened across all three countries. Next slide, please. So just so what do we recommend, or what do we learn from this? I mean, first of all, trade agreements work. Trade agreements work. So it's a good idea to keep pursuing economic integration and continuing trade expansion. we do see that the exports are rising, and spreading those exports more broadly, I think will lift up growth in the economy. But if you want the gains to be widespread, it's really critical to reduce that gender biased and industry and occupational segmentation. It's really critical to reduce industry and occupational segmentation by gender. We need to get women across the economy generating contributions and talent in all sectors, not just in these so-called female intensive sectors. And we should figure out how to do that. STEM research, supporting women in STEM. There's lots of different ways we can do that. And targeting labor market adjustment costs for existing workers, especially women, would really help. A lot of times, it's hard for people to transition across industries, and governments can do a lot. So can the World Bank, right? In helping those adjustment costs and the transition. And obviously deepening the reform to try and get exports to spread even more widely, right? We can do that by improving the business environment and reducing investment barriers and lowering the cost of formalization and making private sector investment more attractive in terms of wages and job security would be important steps that we could take to make sure those benefits are widespread. Next slide. Thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to the discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Back to you, Coach.
Thank you very much for your presentations. And then we received several questions, and I actually just forwarded those questions to both of you actually in email. So please also check in terms of the text. But let me read those questions. And I'm screwing up my computer screen right now. Yeah, okay. The first question which we received in advance to the seminar, and this is rather broader question. Let me read. In some regions, such as East Asia, regional cooperation and trade among countries have been accelerated. What would you expect in terms of possible results and observation in these regions if you run a similar analysis as you did in MENA? I think what would be the potential lessons learned from your analysis in MENA for other regions such as East Asia and other regions? That's the first question. And then second question, the question from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much for your questions. Let me read. Excellent findings. Thank you so much. And the first question. What would be the best way to increase export? One, improvement of quality of the product. Two, price of the product. The three, infrastructure such as port and roads to increase export. So what would be the best way to increase export? And then his second question, food shortage is expected. Would export of agricultural product increase female contribution to export? So these are the questions and comments from the Professor Yoshino. So I would like to invite Gladys and Raymond to come in and then make comment responses to those points. Thank you.
So let me answer the first question, and maybe Ray can come on the second. On the first question, thank you very much to the audience for listening to us. It's very interesting, Koichi, because as you might know, we have done this kind of analysis for several regions. We did it for South Asian. I think we presented the findings there. Of course, we are doing it with MENA. We did it for also some countries in LAC. And now we are working in East Asian Pacific. So we are doing the analysis for Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Hopefully in some months we will come back to you with some interesting findings. And we just kind of discuss some of these results in a recent conference. Because as Raymond said, each country is very particular. No, the challenges that Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia are facing, although some might be similar to what South Asia and MENA experience, there are characteristics particular to them. For instance, in the case of Vietnam, the two kind of work that we are doing there is to understand this energy transition and the impacts on local labor markets. And we are also trying to understand the direct and indirect effects of exports on services, because they have been able to advance in terms of manufacturing and are looking at the next stage, what is the connection with services in terms of green growth. And that's kind of the work we are doing there in Vietnam. In Cambodia is how to boost even further manufacturing and the connection with poverty and inequality. And in the case of Indonesia, it's very interesting because contrary to these other two countries, Indonesia has been going more inward looking. No, they had a period of trade liberalization, but now, because of what Raymond said also at the beginning, is like also globalization is under attack, let's say. No? It might, some policymakers see as an instrument in order to leverage growth, but some others also see as could potentially be harmful to certain particular groups, no? So unfortunately, the case of Indonesia, it has been more on the inward looking, but we are working there on two issues, on informality, mainly, and also the connection with poverty and inequality, and showing why it's important to continue deepening trade liberalization and the potential gains that this will bring to the economy, and particularly the poor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions and for attending. So the two questions I think that remain, Gladys did a great job on the first one, is the best way to increase exports. One of the main lessons that comes from our study, obviously, is that these trade agreements really work. The trade agreements are very effective at increasing economic integration and promoting exports in some countries. I mean, maybe not everywhere, but definitely in MENA, and there are ways to make trade agreements more effective, right? And you have to do that, you have to make sure that they're reducing trade costs. So on the policy level, on the national level, it's really about reducing those trade costs, which could be infrastructure, as the question mentions, right? It could be other things as well in terms of logistics or tariffs or other types of non-tariff barriers. Those things are all critical to try and promote it. But at the firm level, which I think the questions seem to be really thinking about the firm level for some export advice. I mean, three of the things that have come up, obviously, in our research generally, have been number one, product differentiation, right? It's important to differentiate products from a very large field. The second one is obviously striving for lower cost, and you want to make sure that your workers are productive and that the overall labor costs, you don't want to sacrifice working conditions, right, to drive down costs, but you want to make sure that workers are productive and supporting workers to drive down costs. And then the third one, I think, is direct marketing is another way that people have been very effective at increasing exports at the firm level, right, is finding those direct marketing links. So I hope that's helpful. I mean, I hope that answers the question. There was a third question about the global food shortage and exporting agriculture, and whether or not that's going to affect labor force participation, particularly for females. And yes, I mean, I think that the answer is clearly yes, because women's labor force participation rates in agriculture are very, very high. And this is around the world. It's, throughout around the world, we see that women are very, very active in agriculture, but they're not always active in formal labor, in formal agriculture. And that's part of the problem. A lot of exports are coming from formalized labor, formalized agricultural exports. And so the real struggle that I think we have is how do we get women into those larger exporting, formalized agricultural sectors that are exporting. I think there's ways to help women make the transition from what some people might call a traditional sector to the modern sector, which is still prevalent in many developing countries. But I think we need a lot more research and a lot more policy attention on helping women in particular make that jump. So I hope that was helpful, and I'm looking forward to the next question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, you responded to all the questions that we received. So before wrapping up, I would like to ask Gladys and Raymond to share with us any final remarks, any messages, and then we wrap up our seminar. So Gladys, over to you.
First of all, many thanks, Koichi, for hosting the seminar and helping us to disseminate the findings of the report. And three things. First, I think this study is really, really valuable because in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, there is a scarcity of information and data. And it took us a lot of time to put together this report precisely because it's very intensive on data in terms of trade, workers and firm. And so in itself, on that front, I think it's extremely valuable resource for academics, policymakers. The second is, as Raymond said, is doing this analysis country by country has helped us to deepen the understanding of the factors that are associated with these changes. And in the case of MENA, which is the particular concern is the low female labor participation, I think the results here are very telling in terms of what can be said like good intentions, but sometimes not the expected outcomes in terms of how these policies are conducted and might affect some groups, and it's the importance of bringing everyone on board in terms of expanding growth and trade opportunities. And finally, as Raymond said, it's also very important how to deepen the connection between trade and labor market and reducing the cost for people to take advantage of opportunities. In the case of MENA, will be idiosyncratic and some other very, very, very clear, but that's kind of also the work we're doing currently with Raymond, trying to deepen and understanding better what is constraining women to participate in the labor force. Thank you very much, Koichi.
Yeah, I just want to thank you too again, Koichi, for such a great job moderating, and thanks to everyone who's watching. And obviously, if anyone has additional questions, we'd be more than happy to engage with you. Please reach out to us, and we'll be looking forward to your questions and anything else we can do to support advancing knowledge in this field. So thank you very much.
Thank you. With us this morning from Washington and Texas, we had the Gladys Lopez Azevedo, who is a lead economist and the global lead of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank. And we have Professor Raymond Robertson from the Texas A&M University. Thank you very much for both of you for your presentation and responding to all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Koichi. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We have one more morning seminar this week, tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, Friday, 8 a.m., July 21st, we are going to feature the new report titled The Effect of the Multinational Enterprises on Climate Change, subtitled Supply Chain Emissions, Green Technology Transfer, and Corporate Commitment. We are going to have Victor Steenbergen, who is a senior economist of the World Bank Invest Climate Unit, presenting the main point of this report. This will start at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning in Japan Standard Time. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for watching the seminar and see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.